Well, I have the great joy and privilege of having an old friend, Alexander Lingas, with us today. Many of you would have already known of Alexander's work. I'd like to just introduce him a bit first. He's perhaps best known for his wonderful ensemble, um, the Cappella Romana, but also some of you didn't know before that would have heard the wonderful chant at the king's coronation. He founded or gathered a Byzantine chant ensemble and chanted during that. But he's very much a scholar as well as a performer. He did a doctorate at the University of Columbia, I think in Sunday matins, is that right, of Hagia Sophia? Yeah,
Yes.
then later on went to study theology under Bishop Callistos, who was my spiritual father for many years. I'd love to ask you how that was. He's a wonderful man. So he's a professor, he's the rector and founder of Cappella Romana, as I mentioned. He is Professor Emeritus of Music at City University London and a research fellow at the Institute of Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge. So a wonderful combination of as it were, theory and practice. I've asked Alexander to come on this podcast, which is on the theme of liturgical art in general, because I'm really keen on trying to reintroduce a greater wholeness to liturgical art. In the past, you tend to get sort of architects doing the thing, and then you might get a liturgical painter to sort of do what they can with the gaps that have been left, but the architect hasn't really considered what it would be like to paint the walls, and perhaps the architect hasn't considered acoustics, so they should be having dialogues with people like Alexander first. So I like to see a much more holistic approach. So that's why I wanted to talk with Alexander today, who represents the audio part of liturgical art. So perhaps, Alexander, you could tell us a bit about your latest project, what you're working on at the moment.
Well, I'm working on multiple fronts.
Yeah, of course. Silly question. Yes. What things, plural?
I mean, one of the latest projects came out of my residency last autumn at UCLA. I was visiting professor there, and speaking of interdisciplinary things, my host was the art historian Sharon Gerstel.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
so we jointly taught a seminar on ritual and art in Byzantine Thessaloniki. And then one of the things that came out of that was that Cappella Romana prepared a program, a new research program of chants for the vespers of St. Demetrius, as it would have been celebrated in the old cathedral rite of Constantinople, but which held on at Thessaloniki longer than it did actually at Constantinople itself. And we had the great joy as well of involving some of the students. We had the university chamber singers, the UCLA chamber singers, take part as the choir of the readers, because the old rite of Hagia Sophia had sort of concentric circles of singers. You had the sort of the soloists at the top of the pyramid, and then they were supported, they were part of a choir of elite singers, the psalte, and then you had a larger group, the readers, the anagnoste, who would sing refrains and sort of less complex choral chants. And then there were other things that the congregation would also get involved in singing shorter responses. So because we wanted to give an oral sense of that kind of pyramidal structure in terms of how the liturgy was organized sonically, we rehearsed with and had the chamber singers sing with us as the choir of the readers, joining us in the refrains, which was really
That's interesting.
Wonderful.
We now have services of ordination for a reader, but the original ministry of a reader was actually to be part of the choir, effectively. But they would intone the readings, the epistle, whatever. But they're actually considered almost part of the choir rather than just
yes. Well, if you see the legislation from the Emperor Justinian or Heraclius, where they list as part of that legislation how many clergy were attached to Hagia Sophia and its dependent churches, and so there was a kind of elite group of small group of 24 or 12 cantors, depending on how they're structured in different groups, but a much larger of hundreds of readers, and that makes no sense. You only need one person to read, in terms of one of the the pericopes that come through and the cycle of the readings of the church. And the reason is because they were singers. They were what you'd call in Baroque music the ripieno chorus, and so they formed the larger group, and that there were these soloists, and then also, of course, there were other groups. They had the Hagia Sophia, the choir of the Imperial Orphanage. You had a choir of deaconesses as well that we know from the rubrics. So the kind of one size fits all is really a later development. I mean, you had the old rite of Hagia Sophia, like some of these other forms of worship that emerged out of the great metropolises of the late Roman Empire. Really were designed to incorporate kind of everyone's
wow.
somehow.
Very different from now. I mean, I think convent parishes tend to have more participation, but more traditional, inverted commas, parishes, everyone's just a listener, really. But you're saying the early liturgy is actually much more participation in the congregation.
Yes, but in a very structured way. So that one of the problems is that we get people today who have read, say, some early church fathers speaking about their passages where they talk about the participation of the people, and if you don't know how the old liturgy was structured, the old cycle of prayer, that you superimpose on it other models. So I mean, certainly the model that anyone has had in Christianity since the time of the Reformation, and which occurred at the same time, not coincidentally, as the invention of the printing press, is you hand people a hymnal. And that assumes that you have, certain rates of literacy, that you have mechanical reproduction of text, and then just have everybody congregationally sing the liturgy somehow. And that's not at all how it worked. You have to, again, think of what were the rates of literacy, how expensive it was, the technology for any reproduction of texts, meant scribes copying things individually. And so that the way those ancient services managed to incorporate participation was through the use of refrains, where once you hear a refrain once or twice, that then you can reproduce it. And that sort of call and response structure is really what you find, at just multiple permutations of that in the old cathedral rites of late Roman antiquity.
And I suppose also you would have refrains, which you wouldn't necessarily need a cantor for, because it's the same every time, perhaps. So
well, exactly. And the thing is that you have the singers to lead, the designated singers to lead that, but then everyone could join in, and that it kind of takes on its life of its own. But for texts that are variable, for music that is more complex, because otherwise you're left with the lowest common denominator. And so the way that they created this wonderful varied structure of worship sonically is to allow people to do the things they did best at particular times, so that the soloists would sing these great chants, the Alleluia, the Prokeimenon, certain other chants from the Ambo, and you would then have the designated choir singing more elaborate chants that were within the capabilities of a trained group of musicians. Then you would have, again, sort of concentric circles. And yes, it's a model that it's there if one looks at the texts of our services within the Orthodox Church, that there are the remnants of that in many places. The antiphons at the beginning of the Divine Liturgy, at the prayers of the Mother of God, and so on. Those are remnants of the old stational sort of moving from place to place liturgy across the city of Constantinople. So there may the various dialogues where you have short responses, Lord have mercy, grant it, O Lord, which we in some ways in more recent traditions, those we've sort of gone to the other extreme and highly musicalized those, so that especially if they're written for a choir singing in multiple parts, that each single Lord have mercy response is like a little motet somehow, a little composed choral piece, which then also completely defeats the purpose of the structure of call and response refrain, that it should be something that if it was originally designed for the congregation to be fairly simple. But that didn't mean that everything was simple. It just meant those things according to form and function.
As I understand it, and correct me if I'm correct, in the early church, there are basically two rites, the cathedral rite and the monastic, and basically the monastic tended to take over. Is that, first of all, is that true? And secondly, if it is true,
So first of all, no,
oh, right.
actually,
Oh, interesting.
it's scholarship has actually changed its consensus on that in the last little while. I mean, that's certainly that a strong monastic cathedral dichotomy is something that we find in the writings, for example, of Saint Simeon of Thessaloniki in the 15th century. However, if you look more carefully what he was actually doing, and his cathedral was the last cathedral, the Cathedral of Thessaloniki, to serve the old rite of Constantinople on a daily basis for its more basic morning and evening prayer cycle. And so he makes this distinction, but in some ways if you read between the lines, it's because he is trying to preserve the old rite. And then he says, if you read him also carefully, he says, and by the way, I've added the canons and other melodies that people are used to hearing, so they don't complain.
Right.
So supposedly, if the other monastic rite was less musical, but he's adding music from it to that. So in fact, how this has been reframed in some very recent scholarship is really to see this as a competition between, on the one hand, different regional traditions, specifically those which Saint Simeon does mention too, but those of Constantinople and Jerusalem, in terms of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and that those basic structures could be done more or less musically, so that the rite of Jerusalem, it is possible to do some of its services in a very simple way. Compline will be done in the cells, as some of the books of rubrics will say. But at the same time, that they can also be done in a very elaborate way, and the way that the kind of the prototype for them and for the creation, for example, of a lot of the hymnody that we have associated in some of the scholarship with the monastery of Saint Sabas outside of Jerusalem, that it seems that, well, even people like Saint John of Damascus, that they spent time working at the cathedral in Jerusalem, at the Basilica of the Anastasis. And so the discovery of things like copies of the old hymnal of Jerusalem in Georgian translation, or a few manuscripts that were among this group of the new finds of Sinai, have shown really that the Cathedral of Jerusalem continued to be a kind of creative driver of liturgical development in that region for a lot longer than people suspected. So I think that there is, I mean, one of my friends and colleagues, Professor Stig Freuschov, the way he phrases that the prayer of the church is essentially one, but that again that there is also, in terms of its daily cycle, and that can be done in different ways depending on context, but that also that it needs to be distinguished from the type of say psalmody that was done for the purposes of spiritual formation by monks individually, the kind of which they sometimes use the term meleti, which in modern Greek just means study, and that type of psalmody or spiritual formation on a kind of individualistic basis being constant is certainly a part of monastic practice, but it is still distinct from the daily cycle of prayer, the divine office. Again, and there are certainly halfway houses and so on, but I think the hard cathedral and monastic distinction is something that has been in need of revision, especially in light of what we found about how long the Jerusalem tradition remained dynamic.
Interesting you should say that about Jerusalem, because when I was researching for my book, Festal Icons, part of which is to study the development of festal icons through the centuries, it's really clear that the Holy Lamp had an enormously important role in establishing the canon of iconography. And because so many people went there as pilgrims, they wanted, as it were, some sort of holy tit-tat to take back with them. They would have a ampulla, for example, with a bit of holy oil, and that would have an icon on it. Often it was in clay or sometimes lead. So it was a relief icon. And they would take that to England or France, and people would see that icon and think, oh, we'll do one a bit similar to that. But because of the Arab invasions, much of this evidence has been destroyed, and the ampullae, for example, have survived largely because of a large collection in Italy. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I think we need to give much more credit to the Holy Land as a real powerhouse of liturgical art. So it's interesting that in terms of chant and music, this has been
yes. Well, I mean, just
reassessed
look at the
recently.
spread of the system of the 8 modes, the octoichos, which seems to be an invention of the Church of Jerusalem or of the region around it, and it is something that most, not all, but most of the larger Christian churches ended up taking back to themselves somehow. So this is what the Franks did. They imposed the octoichos, the system of the 8 modes, on the body of Roman chant that they had received, and they even created new books to give indices of these chants according to this modal system, the tonaries. And then when they started creating new chants, they created them according to the system of the 8 modes. And something similar seems to have happened in Constantinople, where it seems likely that the original Constantinopolitan repertory did not have the system of the 8 modes. There's nothing, and then it was used again as a classification system, which is perhaps explains today also why even in the received versions of melodies of some kontakia, and kontakia come from the originally local Constantinopolitan production, that they fit very awkwardly into the modal system. Melodies like for the Christmas kontakion of St. Romanos the Melodies, Today the Virgin, or Epiphany Simeon today has appeared for Theophany. They are classified as mode 3, mode 4, but they're tunes unlike any other tune in those modes. And so I think that what we have again is that Jerusalem, which produced this musical system and also a body of hymnography that was attached to it, and it's ultimately that body of hymnography that formed the basis for this the form of morning and evening prayer that we now have in the Eastern Orthodox and Greek Catholic churches, the so-called Byzantine Rite. I mean, we have Constantinopolitan sacraments, but we don't do the liturgy of St. James. We do St. John Chrysostom, but we have a divine office that comes from Jerusalem, and the driving force there in its wider acceptance seems to have been this massive body of hymnody that was created.
Yeah, I've often wondered why so much hymnography has actually come from places like Syria and that. Is there any reason for that? I mean, some of our great hymnographers come from there, not from Constantinople necessarily.
Well, the later ones did. And it's because what happened in that region around Jerusalem is that there arose fairly early, it seems, already in the 5th, 6th centuries, a tendency to replace fixed refrains where you sing the same, whatever it be, Alleluia, at the prayers of the Mother of God, save us, whatever the refrain happens to be, the fixed refrains with variable ones that were appropriate to the day. And that tendency then or willingness to accept this greater level of musical variety, and getting back to our earlier point too, means then more things then have to be allotted to the choirs because the texts change more frequently. That I think it's because that was accepted as a principle there, whereas the old rite of Constantinople had, like the rite of old Rome, but even more so, had a very low level of variability. So much so that, say, for Easter Sunday matins celebrated according to the old rite of Hagia Sophia, I can't remember, you would only have 2 or 3 different hymns for the day that were added to the service, because otherwise, well, I mean, Sunday's the day of resurrection, right? So you just do the normal resurrectional psalmody, because it consists almost entirely of biblical, read Hebrew scriptures, Old Testament psalmody. So, right, and you just add today's salvation, Simeon Sotiria, and then I think 1 or 2 more, and that was sufficient. And could you imagine?
It'd be a riot if you did that now.
it would be a riot. There would be a riot that no, and it was one of the first things actually to be replaced by the Jerusalem rite. So even Simeon, back to the 15th century, Simeon of Thessaloniki's cathedral, he did the old rite of Constantinople day in, day out, except on Easter Sunday, even at his own cathedral, it would have just been too boring. There would have been a riot if people did not hear "It is the day of resurrection," the Saint John of Damascus canon. So yeah, but we again, I think we because we're unaware of how the extent to which there was this level of variety within the United Church of the late antique, late Roman world, that where you could even, or even later, that you would go in the 9th century if you were in Constantinople. If you were at Hagia Sophia, you would hear one form of the daily services. You go down to the other end of the city to the Studios Monastery, you would hear another sort, and there might be even yet some other monastic community, say, doing a 24-hour office somewhere else. So
to go back to your original question about what you're doing, is there a record that people can listen to of what you did in Thessaloniki recently? Was it recorded and is it available?
Well, what you can hear actually is what we did on an earlier project working with our colleagues and friends at Stanford University with Bisera Pencheva and Jonathan Abel, the Lost Voices of Hagia Sophia, where we record excerpts of the rite of Hagia Sophia for the feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. And some of the manuscripts that we used come from late Byzantine Thessaloniki, because again, it was the late Byzantine Thessaloniki was the last holdout of that old rite. So just as you were saying that with some of the kind of knickknacks from the Holy Land that survive in Italy, in this case, we have things that were originally Constantinopolitan, but that the manuscript sources survive from Thessaloniki because they were practiced there longer.
Well, I'll put a link up to that. It's a remarkable recording. I just love what these three particular female art historians are doing. Is that they're bringing this much more holistic approach than Shaver and others. The acoustic, the resonance of the architecture, and even the choice of marbles to sort of reinforce that sense of water moving. Just the wholeness, which is really exciting.
Yes, no, it's been, I mean, it was wonderful to work on that project, and also then with the colleagues in Southern California as well, with Sharon Gerstel and Chris Kyriakakis of USC, who did themselves were part of another project on the churches of Thessaloniki. And unlike, say, the Stanford project, where they had permission to take acoustical readings of Hagia Sophia, Constantinople, but not sing in it, back in the days when it was still a museum.
I think you burst balloons, didn't you? And
they
then
burst balloons, and then later on they did sign sweeps. So there are a couple layers of readings, and plus some earlier ones by a Danish team too that were incorporated into it. But with Thessaloniki, you have churches of basically every age of the Byzantine Empire, from early Christian basilicas like Archiropitos to monastic churches from the end of the empire, and so they were able there. Working especially with my former doctoral student, Spiridon Andonopoulos, to sing examples of the repertory that would have been sung in these churches with singers sing it live and record there. So actually it'll probably be out in about maybe 6-8 months, I would say, the recording from Thessaloniki, and there we'll be using the auralization technology to place our recording in the acoustics of Hagia Sophia Thessaloniki. So you'll have be able to comparison shop the provincial cathedral versus the original in Constantinople, but different variations on the same liturgy.
For those who don't know, with computer technology, a choir can sing even in a sort of completely not dead but neutral situation in a studio, and then through computers you can adjust that as though it were sung in Hagia Sophia or whatever, and it's remarkable. So I suppose it's primarily the dimensions of the space Hagia Sophia were a bit different from St. Demetrius, etc., and the computer can really recreate those acoustic resonances, which is remarkable, really.
Yes, and what's changed lately there with that technology is that for a while it's been possible, say, to add reverb, to take a pre-existing recording and then place it in some space. But what the technology now has gone to the point where the singers who are singing it can experience it in real time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So which is very important for the singers, because then as a result, we will react to that sound being generated by the computers in the way that we would act as if we go from one church to another. It's something that singers, experienced singers, will always do is as you go from one acoustic to another, you will adjust your tempo. Because if the sound takes a little longer to die off, you need to have slightly longer gaps, or it changes the way how you taper phrases, and also how you tune as well, because some acoustics will emphasize some harmonics more than others. So what we've found on working with these two projects is that as singers, we are able to make those same kinds of decisions. So in real time. So we, hearing, especially for me as a conductor, the sound of the group in whichever, Constantinopolitan or the Thessalonian Hagia Sophia, then that will affect again how fast we're singing, how long of a gap I will leave between phrases, and the same thing true for all of the other singers as well. So it really is a remarkable thing to be able to do this today.
I read that paper where they recorded the resonance and various acoustic qualities of the oldest churches in Thessaloniki, and the results they came up with mean that these were would be the envy of modern architects. Is how do they create this so consistently? And what was interesting too in that paper was that you could actually hear the spoken voice as well as the sung, because in modern acoustics, you design the space just for singing, but it's useless for the spoken voice. But in these churches, somehow they managed to have both and. So when someone's reading the gospel, you can understand that there's not so much resonance, that it's just sort of cancelling, one would cancels the other out. So that leads to a question I wanted to ask you, and this is a good time to ask it, is that when I was in the USA recently installing some mosaics in Texas, I was talking to a priest there who'd gone to quite a few modern new build Orthodox churches, which ostensibly looked Byzantine, but in fact he said the acoustics in every single one of them was terrible. And that made me think that there's so much we need to relearn humbly from the masters of the past, because this research into the churches in Thessaloniki showed that they got it right every time. Either they consciously knew the sort of secrets of proportion, whatever, or perhaps it was just that they used the right materials. There wasn't concrete. It's difficult to get everything perfectly flat if it's all handmade, whereas if it's in concrete, everything's sharp and flat. Whatever reason. But it was interesting that he said that just about every new church in America he's been to, it's got terrible acoustics. So I had two questions for you. One is, have you, by observation, noticed why some churches are better than others? Is it to do with the height or materials? Do you find a pattern in the various spaces you've sung in that would give us clues to what makes for good acoustics and what doesn't?
I mean, materials is
Materials.
probably top of the list, because the modern buildings, that is ones built from sort of the 1930s onwards, assume that sound will be propagated primarily electronically since the invention of electric microphones. So that the goal has been to suppress resonance somehow, and then have control. And then as the reproduction technology has improved in its various ways, that then the ideal somehow is to have everyone experience the sort of close-up miking that one hears in popular music these days, or speech, and have that be the norm, which means then it's usually terrible for singing. And as we were saying before too about readings or gospel, of course, the traditional way that things are read in the Orthodox Church, and also the Roman Catholic Church as well, there's this tradition there where there are epistle tones and gospel tones and so on in the Roman tradition, that you have this also existing in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, where things are traditionally intoned, especially for urban worship. I mean, monastic worship on weekdays, can be a different sort of thing. But then that also, precisely that project in Thessaloniki showed that some of those late monastic churches actually were surprisingly dry, and in comparison with the earlier basilicas. So the problem today is, if you have this electronic amplification as the root, then there's really no way then for the sound to propagate properly. So when I will walk into modern churches, Orthodox churches, and I will see acoustical tile on the ceiling. To
absorb all the sounds.
It might be a nice basilica-shaped church, and if you had traditional materials, it would sound just fine. But so acoustical tile on the ceiling, carpet on the floor, and or other sorts of sound absorbing surfaces. I mean, one of the issues we ran into with the live performance that we did in Los Angeles at Hagia Sophia, St. Sophia Cathedral, there is that church was designed by people who were used to building movie palaces, essentially. So although it's a domed basilica, and that if you look carefully, that what you think is plaster is in fact, in many cases, it's a green sound absorbing substance. So there is a lot of iconography, and the iconography that is there, then that will reflect. But any of the places between it is this sound absorbing sort of. So it was surprising to everyone how little we could hear across. I mean, if we were when we sang on the solea in front of the iconostasis, where we have a marble underneath us, and we get some resonance from the dome, that helped a lot. But we noticed it especially when we processed around the church singing. So it's something that again, this is taken for granted by modern architects, that's what you want to do, is suppress the sound. But also you have, even for speech, that say, if you listen to historical recordings of preachers or even politicians in some cases, and that the way that they will produce their speech is almost like song. I mean, you hear this perhaps most in the tradition of African American preachings, most clearly still these days, but that it's at the borderline between speech and song, precisely because people are learning to use their bodies to resonant sound. Exactly, in the same way that singers who continue to sing, usually without amplification, are still trained to do. So that's a really difficult, and then convincing people when it's become so much the norm, and especially also for congregants, if they're used, their acoustical model is to have their earbuds in, and to have this recorded by people at close microphone technique, that just the extent to which then the modern buildings, church buildings, will defeat even that hierarchy that I mentioned before, so that you can actually hear that if the celebrant is in the apse, that the acoustics are such that they will be heard, but they are distinctly in the apse at the altar, not coming out of out of speakers all surrounding you. And of course, they're the ones who will have the body mics usually, and maybe the cantor up front as well, or something like this. But then the poor choir, you either it's left to fend for itself in that sort of circumstance, or that they too end up having microphones. And so what you have is this undifferentiated voice from everywhere come at you, and that whole notion of who the singers are, who the celebrants are, and each in their own proper place, that we can might see it visually, but the oral information doesn't correspond to it anymore.
I really do think, in terms of architecture, acoustics, iconography, we Orthodox have too easily lost the plot of what state of soul you're trying to create. Like when you do frescoes, to my mind, you're creating a joyous atmosphere, but one that's interior. You're communal. You're with your brothers and sisters, but the descent of required for prayer is to go from here to here. So that's why traditionally wall paintings have a sort of blue-black background with gentle ochres. They're not sort of individual saints shouting and jumping out. Basically, the wall paintings are just a single icon of the heavenly Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
So they knew what state of soul they're trying to create. And then the decisions are quite easy. And it's the same with acoustics. And if you want the chant to create a certain interiority and compunction, etc., then you design everything around that. But I feel now we just sort of lost that ultimate aim. So you think, right, we've got to hear this guy really clearly, so let's mic him up, and all these different liturgical art forms are sort of fighting, but they're not actually working together as a whole. So yeah, I think much more humility is needed to go back to the earlier modes, not because I'm nostalgic, but I think I just did it so well. You know, we'd presume that everything is naturally going to get better and better. Architecture is going to get better, but you can lose these things so easily if you just lose sight of the main aim of the liturgy. So
No, and I mean what you were just saying about the notion of being surrounded somehow in a kind of gentle way. I mean that it comes through repeatedly in the liturgical texts and also in descriptions of what it is that singers are doing when they are singing in worship, is that we are somehow creating by doing the psalmody and everything else, we are creating an aural icon of the heavenly liturgy.
Yeah.
And that notion of being surrounded by that liturgy in a kind of gentle way, not somebody shouting didactic texts at you
Exactly.
or something like this, but it's that can only happen if you have a resonant acoustic that gently caresses you with the sound, and that you have the sense also, even as a congregation, if you want to have congregational singing, that you are not alone somehow, but that you are contributing to a larger whole that is there somehow just hanging in the air around you. And that if that's gone and all you have is direct sound, closely mic'd, then it completely, you know, negates a lot of that experience. It's just so so frustrating. And then what people do then in the modern times, then if they want that feeling of being somehow the music surrounding them, then they have to go to extremes, like at modern popular music concerts, where they will have loudspeakers that are so loud that and and the bass and everything else, that you are literally pummeled by this wall of sound. It's but in some ways that because we've lost the ability to gently experience this in a and have it wash over us in succeeding gentle waves. It's really,
it strikes me that acoustic qualities in a church and qualities of light are very similar. So a traditional church won't have strong light entering in through low windows. Most of it comes from above. So you've got a drum, most of the light comes through the drum. So you don't actually see the light in the window so much, because it bounces around, then comes down. So you get a sense of the light coming down from above, and then it sort of dissipates. So it's a bit like an icon. You have a golden background which envelops the person. So we're talking here about, in a sense, the whole church being part of the choir. The sound is coming from all around us. We're surrounded by the heavenly host. And traditional Orthodox churches seem to have that quality of light. You don't have a big window with all the light flooding in from one particular point. It's like an uncreated light that embraces you. And because really thick walls are required for stone buildings, the reveals are very deep. So perhaps another parallel with music, of course, with music consists of the sound, but the gap of silence between the sound. And I've noticed, say, having lived in Mount Athos for a while and spent lots of time in services there, looking at the architecture, you realize that darkness is just as important as light. So when you look at a reveal, most of the light is on the inside of the reveal, but then turn the corner and that's dark. So all the time you're seeing this contrast of dark and light. But modern churches full with lots of artificial light, there's very little shadow. So I think again, that's another lesson to learn. I was asked to be a consultant on a cathedral, which had lots of money thrown at it. And they got a lighting engineer who's technically very good, but he wasn't briefed at all about what light means in an Orthodox church. So basically it wasn't his fault, he just wasn't briefed properly. He was treating it like a piece of architecture, have lights everywhere, all over the place, and no sense of mystery, everything was lit up. So the Archbishop wasn't very happy with this, so he brought me in to give advice, and I just basically turned most of it off. Just be controlled where you put light. Like at Mount Athos, you go into a church at night, and all you see initially, the faces of saints, because you've just got an oil lamp with a tiny light, and gradually your eyes adjust. So you become gradually aware of the heavenly Jerusalem around you, all these saints around you. But they use light, very liturgically, of course, the big chandeliers at high points, and they swing them. So because you don't have light all the time, you can then introduce it liturgically. Same with sound. So it's very interesting, this parallel between light and acoustic qualities.
So
Sorry.
if I might, just one thing, because
Yeah.
what you were just saying about the sort of light and sound as well, that oftentimes, say in an Athonite visual, that the periods of relatively low light will also correspond to periods where the music itself is simpler and quieter, and that the services are designed and they're textured in a way with different musical styles and genres and so on, that create a kind of journey of themselves, just like the journey that accompany the journey through the day with the light, or the various decisions that have been made about how to use artificial lighting, when this case would be candles and oil lamps in the original churches. So that again, it's not flat, it's not the one thing all the time, but that there are certain points where the soloist may emerge. And even, I mean, for those who say criticize the use of kratimata, these pieces on non-semantic syllables, so-called non-semantic syllables, these
just before the great entrance, for example.
But I mean, they're used very sparingly in the musical tradition, if you do them in where they're actually called for, and that they are just at these, precisely, perhaps at one point in the Trubik towards the end of a communion verse, right before the return to the Alleluia at the end of the biblical text. It's used selectively, precisely to show to let music sort of proceed out on its own and escape the bonds of the earthly, and then it's brought back, but it's not uniform. No, at the same time that in the same service, you will have the simplest forms of recitation. And I think, again, that we're used to, for some reason, it's all or nothing.
Yeah. But it's like subtlety, yeah. I know you've worked with Lycurgos Angelopoulos, and I've always been fascinated by his work with Marcel Perez on the ancient chants of Rome. As an iconographer, I'm really keen to revive and draw upon for inspiration high forms of iconography from the early West, particularly Romanesque painting, I think is incredible. So what potential do you think there is for reintroducing elements of this ancient Western chant in an integrated way into contemporary Orthodox worship? But technically, can it be done, and can it be done pastorally so it's not shocking? Do you? I'd be interested to hear what you think about that, just on this principle of timeless truths being incarnate in a particular place, not just importing something that's worked in Constantinople. What about reviving some elements of really rich earlier chant that has the same ethos as Byzantine?
I mean, for me, I would be very happy to to go to a church that was, say, serving the old Roman rite, the rite of the urban basilicas of Rome, which was another ancient cathedral liturgy like that of New Rome. It, again, with fairly low level of variability, some borrowings from the Church of Jerusalem, like the Good Friday use of the Trisagion and the veneration of the cross. So, I mean, for what I see, those those older forms, I find them instructive. I find them beautiful. That's one of the reasons I have a choir that does concerts. It's not just, I mean, I sing as a liturgical musician myself. Later today, I'll be going to the church in Canterbury Road to sing the salutations of the 4th week of Lent. But that sometimes we can learn and also, I mean, not just in a kind of way of information, but be formed by the worship of the past. And I think but whether or not we'd want to use it now, I mean, part of the problem is it would be this, you have run into the same problem of, say, trying to combine an East Syrian service with a Byzantine Rite service as well. In that those services are those chants are part of an entire rite. So what you find then is that you find sort of similar forms, and in the two rites, say the rite of Old Rome and the rite of New Rome, of Constantinople, and there are some cases where what you can do within their, for example, where some of the liturgical forms in some parts of the Orthodox Church have decayed a bit. An example of that would be the Alleluiarion. So, I mean, say one of the things that Lycouros Angelopoulos did on his first recording with Marcel Perez of chants from the Easter services of Old Rome, is they recorded these exuberant Alleluias for Easter week, some of which have Greek texts, some of which have Latin in their verses. And the thing is, though, if you and I mean, they're wonderful, exuberant pieces full of the joy of the resurrection. Until recently, when there's been a deliberate revival of the practice of singing Alleluiaria, but unfortunately, one finds in many places where if it's a Greek celebration of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, that Alleluia after between the epistle and the reading of the gospel is passed over Alleluia, 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 and that people think somehow it's if you just were to listen without thinking about what's if you didn't know anything else, what you hear, the sequence is the reader finishes the reading, then the celebrant says, "Oh, peace to you," who just read, and the response is Hallelujah. Yeah. because but then if we go back and we read the liturgical commentaries, those attributed to Patriarch Germanos of Constantinople and other great commentators on the liturgy, we look at the text of the liturgy itself, we look at the musical manuscripts and see that the Rite of Constantinople actually had alleluias that were comparable in scale to those of Old Rome.
Right, okay.
And that it was meant to be part of this sensing of the church, manifesting the glory of God, with this elaborate music in between the two readings, which of course are done in a more comprehensible style. But here's an example of angelic chant, and back in those old churches, that would have been, the soloist would have gone up to the ambo to proclaim it, so it would have been visually dramatic as well when the verses were sung. So I think that's a case where what has happened is people who have been aware of the preservation of that in some of the Western chant traditions, and also, say, to a lesser extent in some of the Slavic traditions, where at least they would do the verses, though though often in a much reduced form, is then to look and see, okay, well, what should our practice be today? Well, and then the options are, I suppose you could revive the melodies of the old Alleluias, though the melodies are different than the modern chant melodies for the same mode. So some people might think it was a bit weird. So what the solution, for example, happened in the Church of Greece, where under Archbishop Christodoulos, they came out with an encyclical, the synod there, mandating the reintroduction of the Alleluiarion, the chant of the Alleluia with its verses. And so what happened was then that people like Simon Karas was kind of a forerunner in this, but also Professor Gregory Stathis and others composed new settings in a kind of suitably elaborate style for the liturgical moment to allow the sensing and all these things to happen in their proper order. As opposed to moving the sensing back to during the reading of the epistle, which then everyone looks around awkwardly
them, yeah.
as so why am I being sensed? Why aren't I listening to the reading?
Yeah.
That everything that happens. So I think that those old chant traditions, unless you are in a Western Rite church, I mean, if you're going to do one of the ancient liturgies of the West, and that is your regular liturgy,
Right.
great, sing it liturgically. But if you're in a Byzantine Rite church, what I would say that you can both benefit spiritually and in terms of your understanding of the history of the faith by hearing it sung in concerts or on recordings.
Because I thought that the ethos of the Alleluia in that ancient Chant of Rome CD seemed to fit very well with an Orthodox ethos. So it's interesting you could say that you said that originally earlier Byzantine rites made more of the Alleluia, but you don't think that you could then therefore take that Roman Alleluia and not seem out of place in a Byzantine liturgy?
Well, part of it is the verses are different. The psalm verses in some cases they're the same. Sometimes they're different. And some, I mean, the Lord reigns, O Kyrios e Vasilevsen, which was used in Greek in the Easter Rite of Easter week of Old Rome. That melody is related to the ones in the Byzantine musical manuscripts. James McKinnon and some others have written about that. So I mean, you could potentially swap that out one for one because it's the same text. But I think, I mean, what I have found, and I mean, I've also not just listening to the recordings, but I have with Cappella Romana done some old Roman chant and other things, either with me conducting or Marcel Perez has also come and worked with us. So in his case, the two times he worked with us, we did the Vespers of St. James from the St. James of Compostela from the Codex Calixtinus, and then the other time was the Machon Mesta Notre Dame with some liturgical propers. What I can do actually, we can add to this podcast. I give an example. With Cappella Romana, we've recorded a couple of those old Alleluias. And so I can and the one
give me links to those, and
yes, I can send you the links to those, so you can hear them. But I think I think because the ethos is this. I mean, that's one of the things that I found that there's in singing that old music from the West. Is that I have a recognition of being on home ground somehow. Although in detail, things, there are differences of detail, but that in fact, that we all are in fact doing the same thing somehow, which I think is a similar sort of reaction that, say, people have today, even going across some of the rites of the current modern Christian East. So that one finds that, say, in the Coptic tradition, that the Coptic divine office, its structure has some parallels and some overlaps with the Byzantine ones, but many things that are different in the way it's structured, or the various Syriac traditions. But at the same, that they are. There's a kind of recognition in the way that the chant is sung, the way that that various types of chant are used within the service in their various proportions, as we were talking about before, to give that texture to the service, and just the kind of attitudes towards it is that here is this tradition that we have been given, and we just do it, and this is our this great gift that we have received from the fathers and mothers of the past, and that this is how we experience God with us, that liturgy is a theophany, and that I think that underlying sort of ethos, so that works across all of the ancient Christian liturgies, from which that have survived enough of them to use them in some form, whether that be the Rite of Old Rome, or what we can tell of the Old Hispanic liturgy, or and then various offshoots also of the Jerusalem tradition, like that of the Armenian Rite, for example. I think that there is a and this is something too that something in my work as a historian, wondering, okay, well, oftentimes today people tend to make very strong oppositions between the Orthodox East and the West.
Yeah.
And wondering when did some of those things come about, and to when specifically do we begin to find critiques about music, about liturgical singing going back and forth? And one of the very interesting things that looking through the sources is that music was continued to be viewed, liturgical singing, psalmody, as something in common between East and West, even though they were using different rites, pretty much to the end of the Middle Ages. Right. That people who might have criticized, say, from the Byzantine side, have criticized the use of unleavened bread, or all these huge lists of Latin errors that people had. Music is not one of them. And you think they went after just about everything else. Bishops wear rings, for example, as well as the biggies, the filioque and so on. But there are all these other lists that where differences were turned into matters of theological importance, or seen as matters of theological importance. And what we find is quite the opposite. I think it was the Bishop Demetrios Chomatinos, I think 12th century, if I remember correctly, that he one of the things he says, well, yes, we have these issues with the Latins, and he's talking about the funeral offices and what happens if you have to bury, if someone needs a burial from the Latin tradition. He said, well, the psalmody is in common. And the thing is, it's in terms of their different rites. I mean, the psalms you would have at a Byzantine rite funeral would be different ones from a Roman rite one, but that this was not yet recognized as a difference. Yeah. And so it's really only in the 15th century that we start to find some critiques, and that has to do with things like polyphony and the use of instruments and so on. So I think there really is that commonality.
The visual art changes. I mean, Gothic is sort of an overlap period. The Romanesque would be probably the last period, sort of fully iconographic in its spirit. Then gradually naturalism moves forward. But certainly 15th century, you do have a big difference. And people who Easterners who went to the West do begin to comment then on these works that they don't really recognize as sacred art. It's too naturalistic or too sentimental or whatever. So interesting, it's only quite late that they begin to notice, as it were, differences in essence of the musical ethos.
Exactly. I think that the visual arts and the musical ones parallel each other very well in that respect. And I just saw, actually, went last week to see the Siena exhibition.
Oh, right.
At the National Gallery, which had previously been in New York at the where I missed it at the Metropolitan Museum. So and again, just that so much of that is still a common world, and that the mutual recognition that would have operated, which again you see again with the liturgical music of the period, even though people are using different rites. And again, that's the same thing that people were able to. You were doing St. John Chrysostom or St. Basil in Constantinople, and you were doing James in Jerusalem, Liturgy of St. James in Jerusalem, but people recognized those, or what some was called in the Italian peninsula in its Greek forms, the Liturgy of St. Peter, the Roman Mass in Rome, and there was mutual acceptance of these things, that everyone saw that yes, we are all doing the same thing in slightly different ways.
One project that I've been conceiving for quite a while, and more recently has taken a more definite form with one of my students, is to create a sort of a small church in Britain that it's fully Orthodox, recognized as such by Greeks and Russians and anyone like that. But on the other hand, also English people would recognize elements that draw on the best of their own tradition. For example, the tympanum, which I think is a great invention in the West. So the idea is to make a small church, not just the architecture, but also the way the icon screen is made, drawing on some of the traditions of the rood screen and things like that. So I have a sort of a theoretical question. Let's just say you're employed in such a church which is, let's just say it's 80% English converts, British converts, and then Greeks and Russians. And you were employed to be the choir master, and you could do whatever you wanted with the music. Obviously, use the rite of the Orthodox Church, but musically you could do what you want. You had a skillful choir that could sing whatever you wanted. It had all the money you needed. What would be your ideal way to perform the liturgy musically? I mean, would it just be the straight Byzantine chant but in English, or what would be your ideal way to perform the liturgy? The Eson, for example, if you use Byzantine chant, how important would the Eson be, etc.? I suppose I'm asking you that question because I've asked the question myself. If I were to be involved in architecture and the iconography of such a church, how much would I draw on the Byzantine? How much would I draw on the Romanesque, for example?
I think my first thing I would do is try to get an idea of who the congregation is.
Okay.
And
let's just say it's 80% British born and, for generations.
Okay.
British born. Okay. So the converts or second generation.
Yeah. I mean, but also more in terms of even also liturgical expectations. Okay. There's a certain, I mean, so there's a balance that one has to have as a choir master, especially in a multi-ethnic situation, in a situation where there is not an overwhelming predominant sort of culture. I mean, because there can be things that have been accepted in the Orthodox Church as completely natural, depending where you are, can be very different. I remember you speaking of Lykuros Angelopoulos. When I would be singing with him daily services in Athens, and there's this practice, of course, in the Greek tradition that as people are filing by to receive the andidoro, the blessed bread at the end of the service, that the choirs will often sing something, and I'd been there for a few weeks in Athens singing with daily services, and he said, "So what should we sing?" And he's expecting me to say, "Oh, let's do this Polealeos or this bit of the canon or this," and I said, "I'm really missing Rachmaninoff right now." And he said, perish the thought. I mean, Angelopoulos himself, he did contemporary music. He was very well educated in the music of the West and so on. And he said, basically, sort of, that's fine for other places, but not here.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's understanding that. Now, what I think from a purely practical point of view, that Byzantine chant as a baseline is a very effective way of doing the services, because it is a system that, even though you can see that it has changed and adjusted in various ways over the centuries, that it is still recognized as a kind of lingua franca in a large part of the Orthodox world, from Moldavia to the Middle East. It is a complete musical system. It has the system of the 8 modes, and if you are doing things according to best practice, that all those hierarchies of the different styles of music all work and integrate very well. So and in a sense, that way, as a kind of international language, musical language, that it is a kind of complement to how the Gregorian chant became as it was gradually imposed over the Latin West. So I would probably say I would choose that as my base repertory.
Yes.
And also because I think it is a more not just attractive, but also more satisfying, somehow works better with the services, because it is so complete in terms of all the genres and everything else, than say the Russian court chant of the 19th century, where essentially the system of the 8 modes has been reduced to a point of things like Anglican chant, little harmonic formulas that are just repeated in small cycles, and that's it. I think so. It's just as a musical tradition, especially if you only have one person or 2 people singing, that Byzantine chant works better. If there were things out there right now that could perhaps do the same thing for Znameni chant, another kind of, equally monumental, covering almost as much ground as the received Byzantine tradition, I would say, well, great, that might be an option as well, but probably not. So what I would do is I would suggest probably do that, and then build from there. And then especially if you have a congregation that has people come from different cultural backgrounds, expectations, that polyphony for them, the singing in parts, means for them church in a way that, say, for Angelopoulos' congregation in Athens, that it might mean somebody else's church.
Right.
So to use selectively music, in parts of various kinds at different points, I think the parish I sing in Oxford itself has a kind of multi-ethnic mix of languages and styles of music, which I try to adapt to as well as I can, depending on the people there. So I think that's how I would proceed. I mean, I'm very interested and moved by and watching the creativity in the modern Orthodox Church as well. So there's been a lot of very beautiful liturgical music that's been written. Some things perhaps more suitable for concerts, but other things working very well liturgically, that I think would be very effective in a liturgical environment. There's a wonderful treasure house to choose from. And especially in the West, quote unquote, but if in Britain, it would be a positive thing. It would, I think, for the congregations to have more than just a limited diet of only Byzantine chant, even if that's kind of the base repertory. But then you want us to sing a cherubic hymn in parts by I don't know who, or one in or a communion verse, or especially any of the chants that are more elaborate, where in the Byzantine tradition there also is variability, where you can swap out different settings. That would be the place where I would probably do that. And whether if you want to do more or less of that, again, that would depend on pastoral circumstances.
Oh, that's a wonderful answer. Thank you. Just one final thing before we go. In the parish I grew up in Shrewsbury, just for practical purposes, when we started, we tended to use the Slavic tunes with English words. But the last 2 years, we've been moving to entirely Byzantine tunes with English words. What would you say are the most important things to have in mind for a Westerner learning Byzantine chant to actually enter into the spirit of it? Because I've noticed initially they tend to read from Western notation and it sounds more like a march rather than that lovely sort of flowing, unified effect you get with real Byzantine chant. So any advice making that transition into Byzantine chant so that you're singing it, as it were, authentically from the soul rather than just reading mechanically?
Yeah. I mean, there is a kind of subset of Greek cantors who will sing with very pronounced rhythm and sometimes very cutting off the ends of phrases and so on as well. So I suppose one of the things that you have to be careful about is not to lose the forest for the trees somehow. So if you're coming at the tradition, not already having heard it all your life, and especially in a context where there's probably overlap also with your folk traditions, as there is in Romania or Bulgaria or Greece, that I think don't worry about getting hung up on all the little details of ornamentation, or making sure you sing exactly the right tunings according to the Patriarchal Commission of the 1880s, or any of those things, because that way lies madness. And I think that the notion that a basic sort of musicality and communication of what's going on in the service at this point, the ethos of the service is paramount somehow, and that then as your knowledge deepens, that then you will be able to do more. So, and also don't try to do the hardest possible things first. There are simple versions of things, and those are just fine for practical purposes. And then you know, once
gradually develop.
Yes, I think it's a question of gradually developing it. I mean, I've had this experience too in various ways, dealing with singers who have no background at all, or in educational settings, or when I taught for a few years at Arizona State University um, in Phoenix area in Tempe. I ended up as a choir director at a parish that had a choir that sort of sang in parts. That they'd sort of declined a bit through the years, and was mostly an organ that was covering the extra parts for them, which anyway, be that as it may. So one of the things that I did with them was I sort of weaned them of the organ, and then and got them singing some chant, but then and I gradually introduced actually some music in parts. But the first thing was that I introduced fairly simple things, and just to get them to listen. They were used to singing everything in Greek as well, except their liturgical Greek wasn't all that good.
Right.
And so what I focused on first was also getting them to do things, you know, working on the text, if they were going to do things in Greek, that make sure that we had a proper sense of phrasing and pronunciation in the text. And then with the English, if for the variable hymns, the ones that would just come around a troparion of the week or whatever type of thing, I had them do it in English, because there just wasn't enough time to rehearse it properly, to get to a level where it would be you know, stylistically, you know, acceptable. So I think, you know, but then over time, I was able then, okay, now we've sung this melody. Now you see what's, you know, da da. Maybe now can you sing da? You know, just adding little ornaments, little things like this here and there, and gradually, okay, now actually you know that we're singing da da da, but really we should be singing da da da. You know, that the third is actually a little bit lower in this mode, and you know, you can work in those things over time. But I think it's meeting people where they're at, putting first and foremost the sort of smooth, seamless conduct of the liturgy, and then go from there.
Yeah, I've seen the equivalent in teaching iconography. You get those who are slapdash that need to be tighter, those who are too tight, and they need to relax a bit. And the best iconography is highly proficient, but they have become so proficient they can relax a bit. There's a great exhibition of icons, including 12th century Sinai icons at the in London. And to me, the best ones were the ones where the painter felt like a prophet. He just had the word of the Lord, it had to come out. And he wasn't bothered about doing every window in the building in the background perfectly. And some of the buildings were a bit wonky. But consummate skill, that it was the content which came forward rather than the skill of the painter. He had the skill, but he sort of hid it and served the content. So I suppose good chant is like that. You're not sort of getting tight and
No.
nervous and yeah.
No, exactly. And I mean, some of the chants that are very virtuosic, that and that are assigned as such. I mean, they're core repertory, so that it requires skill if you were to do them for especially certain things, for all night vigils or certain feasts. So it's just an expectation. Yes, you will have to sing these things, but the people who do them the best are the ones where the technique is not in the forefront. It's where you forget the technique because it just happens. And that doesn't mean, on the other hand, that no one should ever sing high or anything, or sing anything difficult. No, because that we've received these melodies, some of them very ancient, and that they're there for very deliberate purposes, to make the word of God, alive and bring it forward to us in these ways. But it's doing it without being self-conscious. I mean, that was one of the things that singing with Angelopoulos day in and day out, that he had this tremendous skill, but that it was always it was at the service of the liturgy. And no, you're here to do, this is what you're here to do, and it's not about you.
Yeah, exactly. Alexander, it's been a real joy to have time with you. I know you're a very busy man, and I must let you go. And I know people are going to really enjoy this. And it's the first time on my podcast where I've had a chanter, a musician, and it's really important that all these different liturgical arts come together as a whole and each serving the other. It's a real joy, Alexander.
Oh,
Thank you.
joy for me too, and thank you for hosting me.
Thank you. Well, I hope we can get together in the flesh again soon. I think we had a spurt of time together over the coronation because, of course, I designed the anointing screen, so it's really great to see you there. But great. All right then. Bye then.